My name is Bronwyn Williams. I'm a commentator and facilitator on bias and diversity. And I have with me today Anita Bentata.
Hello.
How are you, Anita?
I'm great, Bron. It's great to be here talking with you.
And just so that our audience has a better understanding of what you do, can you tell us about the work that you have been doing over quite a few years?
Yes, I've been in the field of psychotherapy and counselling as a psychotherapist for 25 years. And through my own personal journey and that of working with so many clients and engaging with so many people all around the world, I really focus on how we have involuntary responses that limit our choices and our perceptions. And so to me, I call it the greatest freedom. In every given moment, we have the greatest freedom and infinite potential to access choices and transcend what is our past or what is happening in our current life. And I've seen amazing results in my own life and that of my clients when we can go beyond what our logical left brain tells us is what's going on.
Wow, Anita. And just as you're talking, my brain is going zing, zing, zing as I'm connecting the dots between what you're doing and what I am doing. Because I think when we obviously first met via LinkedIn, and then we took that connection into the real world because we both live here in Melbourne. And now we're back into the internet world again because of the coronavirus, but the connection remains. And I know when we first met, we found so many points of connection. So it's been wonderful to journey the last couple of years with you. Now, the conversations that I'm having are all around bias. They're bias conversations. And for me, the area of bias has actually bubbled much more to the surface while globally we've been facing the coronavirus, because I'm seeing the biases of so many different people in different areas, whether it's politics, just ordinary interactions, are really becoming obvious to me. And so I thought we'd start off our conversation today by asking you, Anita, what do you think bias is?
It's an interesting question because, yes, when I was talking, I was getting that zing zing too about both of our approaches and work. And for me, bias as a psychotherapist, because I specialize working with the unconscious, is very much associated with those experiences that cloud what we see, how we label things and limit it. And so it creates a repetition when we're biased. To me, bias it's very fixed and static. It's not flexibly responsive. It's not inclusive. And that, my understanding, happens when we don't have certain skills and resources to have the emotional muscle to step outside of what we already know to expand that. And so for me, biases is very associated with, in psychology speak, like working with complexes and working with, and also working with our involuntary stress response, because it then makes everything more limited and more urgent instead of being more curious. So yeah, I see those defenses as being very aligned with a sense of bias.
That's interesting that you use that word defenses, because that to me has been my observation, is that when we are operating out of our biases, we become very defensive. We want to defend a particular viewpoint or a particular way of doing things, a particular outlook. And we do get really defensive, and that shows itself, and this is probably where I've seen it mostly at the moment, is in the things that we say. The things that I've been reading on Facebook, the comments that I've been hearing. And because I'm attuned to bias, I hear the words, but then I also go, oh, look at what's happening underneath all of this.
Yes. And for me, defenses is a huge passion of mine because they're involuntary. They get activated when we have a certain level of stress, and it's there to inhibit us from being with emotional pain or unbearable thoughts, unthinkable thoughts, unbearable feelings. And so we've got this automatic defense system. And one of the things I'm really passionate about is teaching people, there's an actual map of how the defense system works. That's it's simple to understand, but most people, including therapists, if they haven't had training beyond their basic qualification, they're often working with the defenses and trying to get people out of the defense rather than recognizing you've got to work with the anxiety that's triggered the defense, that you've got to work with those unthinkable thoughts, unbearable feelings, and also to be able to look at what evoked that anxiety. What is it that is natural, your natural instinctual response? If you weren't having that anxiety, what would you be activated, motivated, be instinctually moving into if you didn't have that anxiety defense pattern? That's just, so when you get your anxiety down and you know what instinctual behavior you're not tapping into, then you can explore what's blocking that and get that free. And then the defenses don't happen because you've got far more curiosity and a sense of sureness in your system, that emotional muscle that I talk about. So you can be okay to step outside your familiar zone.
Yeah. And look, that's so interesting that you talk about that anxiety and the defenses. When I shared my keynote, which I call "What's Your Water," because I base what I do around the Chinese proverb that says a fish is the last one to know what water is. So introducing the concept of that our biases are unknown, just like the water is for fish. And I shared my experiences of working on Nauru and how on the very first day that I worked there and we went down into the camp, I had this literally a gut reaction. And there was this rumbling underneath my ribs. And I came, as I reflected on that, I understood that was fear. And it wasn't because the men in the asylum seekers were going to hurt me, but just because they were different. You know, they had different languages, different faiths. And as I shared that, one of the women who were listening to me, she said, "Thank you so much. You have now told me what it is that I feel." Because she has had those like physical reactions in her body, but she wasn't able to give a name to it. And I know, I think both you and I are really seeking to raise people's awareness of what is actually happening in their lives, why they are responding to the stimuli the way that they are, and then how I love what you say about operating out of our greatest freedom, because for me, I know from my personal experience how much freer I am now that I've come face to face with some of my biases. I've had to own them, and that's not a pleasant journey because often they tell us things about ourselves that we don't particularly like. But once we do that, the freedom that is there, and we can flip it on its head, because I have now gone from seeing difference as a threat to difference as an asset, and seeing how can I embrace other people's differences and learn from them, and the whole world opens up.
Yes, absolutely. And one of the things that I talk about is that in our society, we're very left brain focused, which is very black and white, very logical, very just what you see, very concrete. And we're not as connected to our right brain and the body. And the right brain really has a strong connection with the information from the body, just like you were talking about in Nauru. When we have those sensations and feelings that are in the body connects to the unconscious. So the unconscious is always sending us information, but we've lost the art of being able to listen to our whole self and gather that information and use it. And so for me, one of the things when we get that information where we often get tripped up is that we become overwhelmed about what we do with it, and that whereas as a society we don't have adequate skills to be able to notice it, name it accurately, because I do, a lot of people mislabel things. I see that in my practice all the time. But also how to transition out of that into that greatest freedom, because people often loop up because they're stuck in that left brain understanding of how to engage with something. So yeah, I just love letting people know there's easy ways. They're just unfamiliar because it's the way our society works. Is it's like a different language, but you can learn the language, and it is a language that naturally your body lets you know this feels good, and so it creates a desire to keep practicing that till in the neural pathways of the brain that becomes the most frequent, most recent pathway. Because right now, because the brain goes to what it's done most recently and most frequently, we tend to be with our bias, with our fear responses, with our defenses. And that's in those neural pathways. They're really well worn in those grooves, and we're just sliding in them, reacting from them. And it takes a little bit to create new neural pathways, but you feel so much better. So yes, that's a bit about how I understand a bit of what you were sharing.
Oh, good. Thank you so much, Anita. One of the things that is becoming increasingly obvious is the power of story and power of personal experience in helping, not only helping ourselves understand what's going on, but helping other people understand and make sense of the world. And I've shared a little bit about my experience with bias. Do you have an experience or a story that you would be happy to share, either like me, where you've had to confront your own biases, or maybe whether you have been on the receiving end of someone else's bias and how that impacted you and how you responded?
Yeah, absolutely. And I'd really love to hear your input when I'm sharing this story, because what comes to mind for me as to, do you name that as bias? So yeah, just to see where we both sit. Straight away, I guess I go to what brought me into the field of psychotherapy. I was living in domestic violence, and I'd grown up in a childhood of a lot of trauma, neglect and abuse. So for me, there was a bias that you don't actually talk about what's really going on. There was a bias of you've got to put on this smile on your face and act as if you're okay when you're not. So I grew up learning to act as if what was not safe was safe, what was not lovable, and who appeared and felt for me not loving, act as if they are loving. And so that put me in a predicament when I was a young woman, because I was at a party and I met this man and I didn't like the look of him. But from the bias from my childhood, I couldn't show that. And there was such a strong bias to don't show anger. I'd been sent lots of messages verbally and non-verbally about don't be angry. And so I was in a difficulty because I couldn't tell him, just go away, stop following me around the party, because I had to put on that bias of nothing's bothering me, I'm fine, I'm happy to talk with you. And so I ended up in domestic violence, and we had a child together, and then later I escaped. And it took a lot to unhook myself from those childhood and from those adult experiences. So there, I guess, the two most significant bias experiences, and his bias about how I should be, how I should look, how I should speak, how I should serve him, and how I should not have my differences, my own beliefs, my own power. And so that's what really propelled me into the work that I do to help people to not get caught in patterns and only realize something when it's big. It's like to be able to shift it sooner and quicker.
Mm. Oh, thank you so much, Anita. That is a very powerful story. And yes, because see, I define bias was when we privilege one group of people or a set of ideas over and against or to the detriment of another group of people or set of ideas. And what you have shared firmly for me falls into that the area of this set of ideas. You had been taught as a child, you were given a set of ideas about what was safe and what you had to do, and how you were to behave.
Yeah.
The man that you ended up marrying also had his set of ideas that he privileged, that was around what it meant to be a man, what it means to be a woman, what that looks like. And all of those messaging comes at us so early in life, and we absorb it long before we're cognitively aware of what is happening, and we don't question it. And even like from what you've shared, even as a young adult, you weren't yet able to question whether the set of ideas that you had been given as a child was actually helpful or healthy.
Yes, I had just so much anxiety and fear, and I had already a bias towards what other people were thinking. I was disconnected from my own thoughts and feelings. One, because it was too unbearable what I was feeling and I didn't know what to do with it. So I disconnect for it and focus on everyone else. But also because I'd had so many verbal and non-verbal messages to focus on everybody else. And so I had this extreme bias about revolving around other people, which didn't set me up for a good thing. And so even though I knew things weren't right as a young adult, I was intelligent, there wasn't any modeling around me of how do I get out of this. And it was like I had to get to something worse to then go seek help, because when I escaped, the first thing I did was go into therapy to make sure I never got caught in that again. And so then I learned so many incredible skills that have made such a difference for me, that it led me to this thing that I often say is, we all got taught how to cross the road or do up shoelaces and do up buttons, but we weren't taught how to be with our own brain and our own involuntary responses. And so it's irrespective whether you've been in a toxic relationship or not, we've all been limited by something in our life, person or situation, and we often find that that shapes us on how we perceive ourselves or being in the world, or what's possible. And so from living with power over me from my parents in a not helpful way, not what we developmentally need, as well as from the relationship I was in, it's really got me passionate to teach everybody just the basic life skills that we didn't learn. They're vital.
Yeah, I think that's one of the most amazing things about the journey of life, is that we have the opportunity to learn from the experiences that we have, and then to be able to share that. And so as we bring this this conversation to a close, is there anything that you want to add just at the end, maybe around what can we do with our biases, or how can we mitigate the risks that they bring?
I think it's really important that we're kind to ourselves, because when we judge ourselves, it just doesn't help. No one feels better when we're being judged, and we're usually our worst judge to ourselves. So to be kind to yourself when you've got, because we all have biases, it's just it's natural. It's what you do with it that matters. And so to be able to be kind to yourself and to say to yourself, there's a reason why this originally developed. It didn't come from within me. My understanding is it came from outside of us, and we took it in. And so anytime we have a bias, to be able to pause and go, there's a positive, there's a reason why this originally developed, even if I don't know what it is. And to be able to be just curious about, what is it supporting in my system? Where am I feeling fragile or vulnerable or unknown? And just to be curious to to look at it from a different position, so it doesn't have to become this thing that you've got to fix, because then I think it's like we've got this fight and polarity going with us.
Yes.
And that's tricky. So to be able to go into a third position of just kindness and curiosity and allowing and just looking at what else is this bias connecting to.
Oh, thank you, Anita. Yeah, I was very excited when you said, you know, to be kind to ourselves, because we are our own worst enemies. And I often say that our biases are like part of our DNA because they formed so early in life. They're there and they operate unconsciously. And as we become aware of them, yes, to treat ourselves with kindness and to treat other people with kindness, and that we will revert to type. There will be times when we go back to our default positions and without thinking, but to just be kind, not judge ourselves because of what we see as a lapse or a failure, but, you know, and just then decide, okay, these are my biases. I don't want to operate out of it. Oh, whoops, I've done it again. Okay, pick myself up. This is what I've decided I'm going to do, and just keep going.
And if I can just add that when we have a bias happen and we can be with it kindly, then we can become curious about what is this bias flagging that's missing for me? Like it's going to come up to fill a gap in our system. So it actually is a beautiful guide for us to let us know when we're out of the alignment of how we want to be in the world and in ourselves. And we can just become curious about what is this bias flagging that's what's missing for me. What am I needing to access to that would mean that if that was there, the bias wouldn't be there. So it can actually help us grow more. So to just be able to appreciate and become curious about what our bias is wanting us to have access to.
Oh, I love that. That's such a wonderful insight. And so I think we will leave our conversation there because that's such a positive place to end. So Anita Bentata, thank you so much for joining me here on Bias Conversations.
My pleasure, Bron. It's always wonderful talking with you.